The harbour smelled like low tide and coal smoke on the morning Josephine Caldwell agreed to ruin herself. Not that anyone called it that. Her mother called it salvation. Her uncle called it opportunity. The family solicitor, a thin man named Pratt, who wore the same grey suit in every season, called it an arrangement of mutual benefit. He said those words the way men said things they had already decided, with a kind of practiced finality that left no room for questions. Josephine sat very still in the chair across from him and listened. The Caldwell name, Pratt explained, had once meant something in Westcliff Harbor. Her grandfather had built the cannery. Her father had expanded it into a small shipping concern before his lungs gave out 3 winters ago, leaving behind ledger books full of figures that no longer added up, and a house on Elmore Street that the bank now held a lien against. Her mother had been quietly selling furniture since October. Josephine had pretended not to notice. She noticed everything. "Mr. Montgomery has agreed," Pratt said, "to absorb the outstanding debt in its entirety. The cannery, the shipping contracts, and the Elmore Street property will be transferred back to the family within 60 days of the marriage." Josephine looked at the window. Outside, a gull was perched on an iron fence post, perfectly still, facing into the wind. "And in exchange," she said. Pratt cleared his throat. "In exchange, he requires a wife, specifically one of reputable family and appropriate standing." He paused. "The Montgomery Bank is being considered for a federal charter. The committee evaluating the application places considerable weight on the character of its applicants. A man of his position needs to appear settled," Josephine said. Pratt looked slightly relieved that she understood. Precisely. She thought about her mother upstairs resting, which was what they said now instead of declining. She thought about her younger brother Eli, who was 14 and needed a school he would not be getting if things continued as they were. She thought about the gull on the fence post, how it leaned into the wind without fighting it. "When does he want an answer?" "He's asked to meet you this Thursday." "That isn't an answer to my question." Pratt adjusted his papers. "Thursday is the answer, Miss Caldwell. The Montgomery house was not on Elmore Street. It was not on any street that ordinary people lived on. It sat on the bluff above the harbour, behind an iron gate flanked by stone pillars that had been imported from somewhere in Europe. She had heard someone say Scotland once, though she doubted Charles Montgomery had ever been sentimental enough to care about the origin of his stone. The carriage let her out at the front. She walked in alone because her uncle had decided at the last moment that it would appear stronger that way. She was not sure she agreed, but she had stopped arguing about things she could not control. A butler showed her into a room that was clearly designed to make visitors feel small. High ceilings, dark wood, a fireplace large enough to stand in, bookshelves along 3 walls, though the books had the look of things purchased in sets rather than read. The curtains were drawn on the harbour side, which she found strange. The view from this bluff was the finest in all of Westcliff. She stood near the window and waited. Charles Montgomery came in without announcement. No butler preceding him, no footstep warning. He simply appeared in the doorway with the ease of a man who had never needed to announce himself anywhere. He moved without waste. He was dressed plainly for a man of his wealth, in a dark coat, no ornamentation, nothing that asked to be noticed. And he looked at her with an attention that was neither warm nor cold in the conventional sense. Simply thorough, the way one reads a contract before signing it. "Miss Caldwell," he said. "Mr. Montgomery." He gestured toward the chairs near the fire. She sat. He sat across from her, a low table between them, and he did not immediately speak. She had expected that. The silence as a kind of test, the waiting to see who flinched first. She did not flinch. After a moment, something shifted almost imperceptibly at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement, perhaps, of the fact that she had held the silence as long as he had. Pratt explained the terms. He said he did. "Do you have questions?" She had many. She had been composing them for 3 days. She asked the one that mattered most. "Is there a clause regarding children?" He did not blink. "There is no expectation. Is there a clause allowing for them, should circumstances change?" A brief pause. He was recalibrating. She could feel it without being able to describe exactly how. "That could be added. I'd like it in writing, separately from the primary agreement." "Why separately?" "Because primary agreements have a way of being revised. I would rather have certain things standing on their own." He studied her for a moment. The fire snapped behind her. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock struck the quarter hour. "All right," he said. They spoke for the better part of an hour. It was the most businesslike conversation she had ever had in a parlour, and she found, to her own private surprise, that there was something almost restful about it. The absence of performance, the expectation that she would respond with her actual thoughts rather than graceful decorative deflection. Most men in Westcliff Harbor spoke to her the way they spoke to good furniture, with appreciation and no real interest in reply. Montgomery was not like that. He was not warm, exactly, but he was precise. And precision, she was learning, had its own kind of respect embedded in it. He told her the wedding would need to happen within 6 weeks. The Federal Charter Review was scheduled for late spring, and he needed documentation of the marriage on file before the committee convened. She noted that he said documentation of the marriage and not the marriage itself, and she filed that distinction away without comment. He told her she would have her own rooms in the house. Staff would answer to her directly in all matters of household management. She would be expected at formal dinners and public engagements, 2 or 3 per month, on average. Beyond that, her time was her own. "Is that acceptable?" he asked. "It depends," she said. He waited. "I want to continue managing the Caldwell shipping accounts myself, not through an intermediary." He looked at her steadily. "You know the accounts. I've kept them for 2 years." She paused. "My father was ill for longer than people were told." Something moved behind his eyes. She couldn't name it. It wasn't pity, which she would have resented. It was closer to recognition, the brief moment when one careful person identifies another. "That can be arranged," he said. When she stood to leave, he stood as well, which was more courtesy than she had expected. He walked her to the front door himself, without summoning the butler. At the threshold he paused, and she thought for a moment he was going to say something of a personal nature, something that would complicate the clean lines of what they had built in the past hour. Instead, he said, "The solicitors will have a revised draft to you by Friday." "Thank you," she said. She walked to the waiting carriage without looking back. She had learned somewhere in the past 3 years of managing a household that was slowly coming apart, that looking back at things you had already decided was a particular kind of cruelty you inflicted on yourself. She told her mother that evening. They sat in the upstairs sitting room, the one they still had good furniture in, and her mother held her hands and cried quietly and said that her father would have been grateful, which was the kindest thing she could have offered, and also the most painful. Josephine did not cry. She had done her crying in October when the solicitor had first come with the numbers, when she had sat at her father's desk in the dark and understood, finally and fully, how bad it was. She had allowed herself one night of that, and then she had started making lists. She was very good at lists. That night, after her mother had gone to sleep, and the house was quiet except for the wind coming off the harbor, Josephine sat at her father's desk and opened the drawer where she kept the one document she had not shown Pratt, had not shown her uncle, had not shown anyone, a letter written in her father's hand, dated 14 months before his death, addressed to no one in particular. More of a reckoning than a letter, really. 3 pages of careful, precise handwriting that described in full a business arrangement he had entered into 7 years prior, an arrangement that had saved the cannery, briefly, and that had involved a silent partner whose name appeared in no public record, a name she had recognized immediately when Pratt first said it, Montgomery. She had known when she walked into that room and sat across from him that she was not simply meeting a banker who needed a respectable wife. She was meeting the man who had held a private claim against her father's business for 7 years, who had, whether he knew it or not, known the Caldwell name long before she had known his. Whether he was aware of the letter's existence, whether he had simply forgotten, or whether he knew exactly what he was doing, she did not yet know. But she would find out. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases and placed it back in the drawer. The wedding was in 6 weeks. She had time. On the morning she agreed to marry Charles Montgomery, Josephine Caldwell made herself one quiet promise. She would walk into that house with her eyes open, and she would not leave without the truth. The Montgomery house had a rhythm, and it did not ask permission to impose itself. Josephine learned this on her first morning as its mistress. She woke before dawn, a habit from the Elmore Street years, when the day's problems arrived early and stayed late, and found that the household had already been in motion for an hour. Fires lit, breakfast prepared, the kitchen running with the quiet efficiency of a machine that had been calibrated long before she arrived and had no particular interest in being recalibrated now. The housekeeper, a composed woman named Mrs. Holt, who had been with the Montgomery household for 11 years, met her at the foot of the stairs with a schedule, printed, bound with a small ribbon, as though the day itself had already been signed and notarized. "Mr. Montgomery takes breakfast at 7, Mrs. Holt said. "He leaves for the bank at past. He does not take lunch at home. Dinner is at 8, unless there are guests, in which case it is at 7:30. He prefers the dining room to remain quiet during meals. Josephine looked at the schedule, then at Mrs. Holt. What does quiet mean exactly? Mrs. Holt's expression remained pleasant and revealed nothing. He does not care for conversation during meals, ma'am. He reads correspondence at the dinner table. Yes, ma'am. Josephine handed the schedule back. Thank you, Mrs. Holt. I'll need a copy of the household accounts by the end of the week. All of them, including the staff wages and the quarterly supply orders. Mrs. Holt blinked. It was a very small blink, carefully controlled, but Josephine caught it. Of course, the housekeeper said, and withdrew. Josephine stood alone in the entrance hall and looked up at the ceiling, which was high and coffered and painted in a deep cream that would have been beautiful if it hadn't felt at this hour quite so much like the interior of a bank vault. She went in to breakfast. Charles Montgomery was already at the table when she entered the dining room. He stood when she came in, that same reflexive courtesy she had noticed at their first meeting, and then sat again and returned to the papers arranged beside his coffee cup. She took her place at the opposite end of a table that was, in her estimation, at least 12 feet long enough that they could have been in separate rooms and achieved roughly the same intimacy. She poured her coffee. She looked at the window which faced east and let in the early light of a grey March morning over the harbour. He turned a page. She ate. Neither of them spoke, and it was not, she decided, the comfortable silence of people who had known each other long enough to rest inside it. It was the silence of two people performing the same careful act of not being the first to require something of the other. It had a kind of dignity to it, she supposed, and a kind of loneliness that she chose not to examine too closely, at least not yet. When he finished his coffee, he folded his papers and stood. "Good morning," he said, as though the morning were only now beginning. "Good morning," she said. He left. She sat with her second cup of coffee and listened to the sound of his carriage on the gravel drive, and then to the silence that replaced it, and then to the harbour wind against the windows. And she thought, 6 weeks of engagement, and I still do not know what kind of man I have married. That was not entirely true. She knew certain things. She knew he was precise. She knew he was not unkind, which was different from being kind, but which she had learned not to undervalue. She knew that the servants respected him without visible affection, which told her something about the temperature he kept in his dealings with people. Warm enough to earn respect, cool enough to discourage attachment. She also knew about the letter, about her father's name in his private ledgers, about 7 years of silence between them that she was now, by virtue of a marriage contract, living inside. What she did not know was whether he remembered. The first dinner with guests arrived 11 days after the wedding, a Thursday. 6 people at the table, 2 partners from the bank and their wives, and a city alderman named Fossey, who had the loud laugh of a man accustomed to filling rooms that hadn't invited him. Josephine wore the dark blue gown her mother had altered for her, the one that was elegant without trying too hard, and she sat at her end of the table and spoke when spoken to, and asked good questions, and laughed at the right moments, and was, by all measurable standards, exactly what the arrangement required her to be. She noticed that Montgomery watched her once, from across the table. In the middle of a story, Fossey was telling about a hunting trip that had gone badly in the Adirondacks, not with any particular expression, just watching the way he watched things, with attention that did not announce itself. She did not acknowledge it. She turned to the banker's wife on her left and asked about her daughter's piano studies, and the woman lit up the way mothers always did, when someone asked the right question about the right child, and the conversation turned warm and easy. Later, when the guests had gone and the house had settled back into its nighttime quiet, she passed him in the hallway near the stairs. He was coming from the study, jacket off, papers in hand. She was coming from the kitchen, where she had spoken briefly with Mrs. Holt about the evening's expenses. They both stopped. "You were composed tonight," he said. It was not, she understood, an empty compliment. He was a man who did not produce empty compliments. He was observing something that he found worth noting. "It wasn't difficult," she said. "Mr. Fossey is very fond of himself. It makes him easy to manage." Something happened at the corner of his mouth again, that almost movement she had begun to recognize as his version of amusement, here and gone before it could be named. "Yes," he said, "he is." He went upstairs. She stood in the hallway for a moment and looked at the place where he had been standing, and she thought that this was what it would be then. Moments in hallways, brief calibrations in the dark. 2 people who had agreed to share a house and a name and a set of public performances. meeting occasionally at the edges of each other's lives. She could live inside that. She had lived inside harder things. It was the library that complicated her. She had assumed it was decorative, that room full of books that looked unread. She had been wrong. On a rainy Saturday afternoon in her third week in the house, she went in looking for something to occupy the afternoon. She had finished her review of the household accounts. She had written to her mother. She had exhausted her own small stock of books, and she discovered that the shelves were not arranged by appearance at all, but by subject, and by a logic that was entirely personal. Engineering texts beside economic theory, navigation beside contract law, and in the far corner, tucked behind a larger volume on railroad infrastructure, a battered copy of Middlemarch with a broken spine and several pages turned down at the corners. She stood there for a long moment holding it. It was the kind of book you only owned like that if you had read it more than once, if you had read it in a hurry, in parts, picking it up and putting it down over years. The turned-down pages were not decorative. They marked specific passages, and when she looked at them, she found what she expected to find. Not the romantic passages, not the scenes of public drama, but the quiet ones. Dorothea, alone in her room. Casaubon's private failures. The slow, terrible weight of a life lived in the wrong direction. She put the book back carefully. She selected something on maritime trade law and went to read by the fire, and tried not to think about what it meant that Charles Montgomery, the most controlled and self-contained man she had ever encountered, had read Middlemarch until its spine gave out. He found her there an hour later. He came in without seeming to notice she was present, went to the desk in the corner, opened a drawer, found what he was looking for, a letter, it appeared, and then registered her presence with a slight straightening of the shoulders. "I didn't know you used this room," he said. "You said my time was my own." "I did." He looked at the book in her lap. A moment's pause. Maritime law. "The Caldwell shipping contracts are being renegotiated in the spring, so I'm trying to understand the liability provisions." He looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than neutral. "Hartley's is out of date," he said. "The decisions coming out of the federal courts in the past 3 years have shifted the standard. There's a more recent survey on the second shelf. Brown cover. No title on the spine." She looked at the shelf, found it, opened to the table of contents. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and left. She sat with the better book and the fire and the sound of rain on the high windows, and she thought about the turned-down pages in Middlemarch, and about the way he had known instantly which text would help her, and about the fact that he had not offered to explain the law to her, but had simply told her where the information was. A distinction that, small as it was, felt like the most respectful thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. She was being careful. She reminded herself to be careful. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks and 4 days after the wedding, addressed to Charles Montgomery in care of the Montgomery Bank, marked private in handwriting she would have recognized anywhere. She did not see the letter itself. She only saw the envelope briefly on the silver tray in the front hall, where the Morning Post was placed before being carried to his study, but the handwriting was enough. She recognized it because it was her father's handwriting, or rather, it was handwriting that matched the hand she had studied for months, the hand from the letter she kept in her desk drawer, the 3 pages of careful reckoning that told her everything and not quite enough. But her father had been dead for 3 years, which meant someone else was writing in his name. And this was the thought that followed her through the rest of the afternoon, like a shadow she could not get ahead of. Someone had been writing in his name for a very long time, and her father had not been the only one who knew the shape of the arrangement. He had simply been the one who felt the need to confess it. She did not go to Charles that evening. She did not mention the envelope. She sat at dinner and listened to him turn the pages of his correspondence, and she kept her hand still, and her expression quiet, and she thought, not yet. She needed to know more before she moved, and she was running out of time to find it. In the Montgomery house, silence was the common language, but Josephine Caldwell was beginning to understand that some silences were not empty. Some of them were full, some of them were loaded, and one of them, she was almost certain, was about to go off. The letter disappeared. Josephine knew because she checked. Not immediately. She was not reckless enough to go searching the same day she had seen the envelope on the silver tray, but 3 days later on a Friday afternoon when Charles was at the bank and Mrs. Holt was overseeing the weekly inventory in the kitchens, she went into his study. She had a reason prepared, should anyone ask. She needed the survey book on federal maritime law that he had mentioned. It was not in the library where he had said it would be, so she had checked his desk. A perfectly reasonable explanation, one that would hold up under even careful scrutiny. The study was as she expected, orderly, sparse, a room designed for work and nothing else. The desk was clear except for a single stack of papers, weighted down with a piece of polished granite that looked like it had been taken from a riverbed somewhere and kept for no reason she could identify. The bookshelves were full, but not cluttered. The fireplace was cold. She opened the top drawer of the desk slowly, listening for footsteps in the hall. Inside were the usual items: pens, sealing wax, a small wooden box containing stamps. She moved to the second drawer. More papers organized by category, correspondence from the bank, personal letters mostly from business associates, a few invitations to events in the city, nothing in her father's handwriting. She closed the drawer carefully and stood very still and tried to think. If he had received the letter, and she had seen it, she was certain of that, then where had it gone? Had he burned it? Filed it somewhere outside the house? Or had he seen the handwriting and known immediately what it was and dealt with it in a way that left no trace? She could not decide which possibility unsettled her more. She left the study exactly as she had found it and went back to the library, and she sat in the chair by the window and watched the rain begin to fall over the harbor, and she realized with absolute clarity that she had made a tactical error. She had waited too long. She had been too careful. And now she was inside a house with a man she did not fully understand, carrying a secret that might not be a secret at all, and she had no clear way of knowing which side of the silence she was standing on. That night at dinner he spoke. It was so unexpected that she nearly missed it. They had been sitting in their usual silence, him at one end of the table, her at the other, the space between them filled with the small sounds of silverware and the distant clatter of the kitchen, when he set down his fork and looked at her. "How is your mother?" he asked. She stopped mid-motion, her glass halfway to her lips. "I'm sorry." "Your mother," he said again. "You wrote to her earlier this week. I wondered how she was." It was not an intrusive question. It was, objectively, the kind of question any husband might ask a wife, and yet it landed in the silence between them like something unfamiliar and slightly dangerous, something that changed the shape of the room. "She's well," Josephine said carefully. "The house is warmer now. She's been sleeping better." He nodded. "And your brother?" "Eli started at the academy last month. He writes that the mathematics are difficult, but he's managing." "He has aptitude?" "He does." Another nod. He picked up his fork again, but he did not return to his papers. He continued to look at her with that same steady attention, as though he had decided something and was now simply waiting to see how it would unfold. "I've been reviewing the Caldwell shipping contracts," he said. Her heart kicked once hard against her ribs. She kept her expression neutral. "Have you? There's a discrepancy in the bill of lading from 1882, a shipment that was logged as delivered but for which no payment was recorded." She set her glass down very carefully. "That was before I managed the accounts." "I know." He paused. "But the pattern continues into 1883 and 1884, small amounts, always below the threshold that would trigger a formal audit." The room had gone very quiet. Even the kitchen sounds seemed distant now, as though the house itself were holding its breath. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm observing a pattern." "And why?" she said slowly. "Are you reviewing contracts from 7 years ago?" He leaned back in his chair. The candlelight caught the side of his face, cast the other half into shadow. "Because I hold the lien on them," he said. "I have since 1882. There it was. The thing she had known and not known. The confirmation she had not wanted and could not avoid. She felt the blood leave her face and then return too quickly, a rushing in her ears that she forced herself to ignore. "You knew," she said. "I knew there was a private arrangement with your father. Yes. When you offered the contract, the marriage, you knew." He did not look away. "I knew." She stood. She did not plan to stand. Her body simply made the decision without consulting her, the way animals stood when they needed to be ready to run. "Did you engineer this?" Her voice was level, but only just. "The debt, the timing, the offer, was any of it real, or was it all simply a way to—" "To what?" he said quietly. "To acquire what you already owned, to make it legal, to—" She stopped. She could not finish the sentence because she did not know how it ended. She did not know what he wanted. She did not know if the marriage had been a rescue or a consolidation, an act of strategy or something else she did not have a word for yet. He stood as well. Slowly. "I did not engineer your father's debt," he said. "I offered him capital when the cannery was failing. He accepted. The terms were clear. When he died and the debt transferred to your family, I could have called it in immediately. I did not. Why not? Because your mother was ill and your brother was 12 years old, and the only person capable of managing the situation was a 19-year-old girl who was already doing the work of 3 men without any authority to show for it. He paused. Calling in the debt at that moment would have been legal. It would not have been just. She stared at him. So you waited 3 years, and then you offered marriage. I offered a solution that allowed you to retain control of your family's assets while satisfying the Federal Charter Committee's requirements for my application. Yes. How noble. His jaw tightened, the first visible crack in that careful control. I did not claim nobility. I claimed pragmatism. You benefited. I benefited. That was the agreement. And the letter? She said. The one that arrived on Tuesday. In my father's handwriting. He went very still. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Don't lie to me. Her voice was sharp now, the careful neutrality gone. I saw it. On the tray in the front hall, it was addressed to you, in his hand. That's not possible. I know my father's writing. Your father is dead. I'm aware. She took a step toward him, and then another, closing the 12 feet of polished table and expensive air between them. So either someone is writing in his name, or you've been receiving correspondence from him for longer than you've told me, or there is something else happening here that you have not been honest about. Which is it? He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him weighing options, calculating, deciding what to give and what to keep. And she realized with a cold, sinking clarity that this was who he was. A man who, even in the middle of a confrontation, was still running the numbers, still measuring risk, still determining the most efficient path through. There was no letter, he said finally. You saw an envelope, but there was no letter inside. She stopped. What does that mean? It means, he said quietly, that someone is attempting to unsettle us, or to unsettle me through you, or to create the appearance of a connection that does not exist. He moved around the table toward her, and she held her ground. I received the envelope. I opened it. It was empty. I burned it. Why didn't you tell me? Because I did not want to alarm you unnecessarily, and because I was not certain what it meant. And now I am certain, he said, that someone knows about the original arrangement with your father, and they are using that knowledge to apply pressure. She felt the ground shift beneath her. Pressure for what? I don't know yet, but you have suspicions. I always have suspicions. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the barely visible scar along his left temple. The question is whether you trust me enough to tell me what you know. Why would I trust you? The words came out harder than she intended. You've known about my father's debt since the beginning. You married me with that knowledge and never said a word. You've been reviewing contracts from 7 years ago, looking for discrepancies. For what? Leverage? Insurance? Some future advantage I don't even know about yet? No, he said. And his voice, for the first time since she had known him, carried something other than control. It carried frustration, maybe even anger, though it was tightly leashed. I've been reviewing the contracts because 2 months ago I received an unsigned letter suggesting that your father's arrangement was not with me alone, that there was a third party involved. Someone who stood to gain from the appearance that I had orchestrated the entire situation, the debt, the marriage, the consolidation of assets. She felt cold. Who? I don't know. The letter was unsigned, untraceable, but it referenced specific figures, dates, details that only someone with direct access to the original documentation would have known, and you didn't think to mention this to me. I thought, he said evenly, that you had enough to manage without adding conspiracy theories to the list. That wasn't your decision to make. It was exactly my decision to make. You are my wife. My responsibility. I am not your responsibility, she said, and her voice was shaking now, the control she had maintained for weeks finally fracturing under the weight of it. I am a person who entered into a contract with you, a contract that you have now violated by withholding information that directly affects my family, my name, and my ability to make informed decisions about my own future. He looked at her, really looked at her, without the careful distance he usually kept. You're right, he said. She had not expected that. She had expected defensiveness, justification, more calculation. Not that. I should have told you, he continued. I thought I was protecting you. I was wrong. The anger in her chest did not disappear, but it shifted slightly, made room for something more complicated. What do we do now? She asked. Now, he said, you tell me what you've been keeping from me, because you have been. I've known that since the day you walked into this house. She looked at him. At the man she had married for survival and strategy. The man who read Middlemarch until the spine broke, who had offered her household accounts and maritime law books and a strange, careful kind of respect that she had not known how to name. The man who had just admitted he was wrong. She made her decision. "Wait here," she said. She went upstairs to her room, opened the drawer where she kept her father's letter, the 3 pages of careful handwriting, the reckoning, the confession. She brought it back down to the study. She handed it to him without explanation. He read it in silence. She watched his face, watched for the moment when understanding arrived. It came halfway through the 2nd page, a small tightening around his eyes, nothing more. But she saw it. When he finished, he set the letter down on the desk very carefully. "How long have you had this?" he asked. "Since a month after he died. I found it in his desk." "And you didn't bring it to the solicitors?" "No." "Why not?" "Because it named you," she said, "and I did not know what you would do with it." He looked at her, then at the letter, then back at her. "Your father was not writing about me," he said quietly. "He was writing about someone using my name. Someone who approached him in 1882 claiming to represent the Montgomery Bank. Someone who offered him terms that I never authorized." The room tilted. "What?" "I gave your father a loan. Standard terms, documented through the bank. But these terms," he gestured to the letter, "these are not mine. The interest rates are wrong, the collateral structure is wrong. Someone took my initial agreement and altered it. And your father, who was desperate and ill, signed it without verifying the source." Josephine sat down, her legs simply gave out. "So the debt you've been carrying is real, but it's not entirely mine. Someone else has a claim, and they've been waiting." "For what?" Charles looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. Something close to respect, and something else that might have been fear, except that she did not think Charles Montgomery was afraid of anything. "For exactly this," he said. "For the marriage, for the consolidation of assets, for the moment when everything is legally bound together so tightly that pulling it apart would destroy us both." She understood then, fully, finally. "They're going to call in the debt," she said. "Yes, and when they do," he said, "we'll lose everything unless we find them first." Josephine Caldwell had married a stranger to save her family. Now she would have to trust him to save them both. They had 6 days. That was what the 2nd letter said, the one that arrived on Saturday morning, addressed to both of them this time, no pretense of anonymity. 6 days to produce full payment on the altered debt, including 7 years of compounded interest at rates that would have been illegal if anyone had bothered to examine them closely enough. 6 days, or the claim would be filed publicly with the Harbor Master's Office and the Federal Charter Committee simultaneously. The amount was impossible. Even liquidating everything Charles owned would not cover it, which meant that was not the point. The point was destruction, pure and clean. They sat in the study with the letter between them, and neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Josephine said, "Who benefits?" "That's the question I've been asking for 2 months." "Then ask it differently." She stood, moved to the window, looked out at the harbor. "Who benefits from your bank losing the federal charter?" "Every competing bank in Westcliff, half the investment houses in Boston, anyone who's been shut out of the federal lending system and wants a way in." "That's too broad. Narrow it down. Who has access to your father's original papers? Who would have known the exact terms of the loan well enough to forge an alteration?" Charles was quiet. She could feel him thinking. "The only people with access to those files are the senior partners at the bank, and they've been with me for years. I trust them." "Trust is expensive," Josephine said. "Check anyway." He looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "You sound like someone who's been managing a failing business for 3 years, while everyone around me insisted everything was fine." She turned from the window. "Yes, I do." He almost smiled. It was gone before it fully formed, but she caught it. "There's one other person," he said slowly. "Garrett Pratt." She went very still. "The solicitor. He handled the original loan documentation. He would have had access to everything, and he was the one who suggested the marriage arrangement. He works for my family. He works for whoever pays him, and I've been paying him for 7 years. Josephine felt something cold settle in her chest. He knew, the whole time. He knew about the altered terms, and he brought me to you anyway. Because if the marriage went through, the assets would consolidate, and when the debt was called, it would take down both families at once. Complete destruction. No way to separate the damage. Charles stood, moved to the desk. He's been building this for years, waiting for the perfect moment. But why? Money. Always money. Someone is paying him more than we ever could. He pulled open the bottom drawer, extracted a thin file she had not seen before. 3 weeks ago I hired an investigator, private, outside the bank. He's been tracking Pratt's financial movements. He handed her the file. She read quickly. Bank transfers, property purchases under alternate names, a pattern of deposits that coincided exactly with major decisions in the Caldwell estate management. He sold us, she said quietly. Both of us. Yes. She set the file down. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the desk. So what do? We can't pay the debt. We can't prove the alteration without the original documents, which he certainly destroyed, and even if we could prove it, we don't have 6 days to fight it in court. Charles looked at her for a long moment. There is one option. Tell me. We give him what he wants. She stared at him. We don't have what he wants. No, but we can make him think we do. He moved around the desk, closer to her. The debt is being called through a shell company. No names attached. But Pratt has to collect it personally, and that's the only way he gets paid. Which means at some point in the next 6 days, he has to reveal himself. And when he does, we have a choice. We can try to fight him legally, which we'll lose. Or we can offer him something better. We don't have anything better. Yes, we do. Charles pulled another paper from his jacket pocket. This is a deed transfer, signed this morning. It puts the Montgomery Bank entirely in your name. She looked at the document, at her name in dark ink. I don't understand. If the bank is yours and the debt is called, I lose nothing. You lose everything. But you're a Caldwell, not a Montgomery. The Federal Charter Committee has no jurisdiction over you. You could simply walk away. Dissolve the marriage, claim duress, and start over. Her throat was tight. You're protecting yourself. No, he said quietly. I'm protecting you. She looked up at him. At this man she had married for strategy and survival. This careful, controlled man who had just offered her a way out that would cost him everything he had built. Why? She asked. Because I made you a promise. The day we signed the contract, I told you the assets would return to your family. I intend to keep that promise, even if it destroys you. Even then, she looked at the deed, at the signature, at the choice he was handing her, and she made a different one. No, she said. He blinked. Josephine, no. She set the deed on the desk. We're not doing this. We're not separating the assets. We're not giving him the satisfaction of watching us tear ourselves apart, trying to minimize damage. She looked at Charles. You said Pratt has to collect the debt personally, which means he has to come here. Yes. When? Likely Monday. The deadline is Friday, but he'll want to apply pressure early. Good. She moved to the desk, pulled out a piece of paper, began writing. Here's what we're going to do. Garrett Pratt arrived on Monday afternoon, precisely as Charles had predicted. He came alone. He carried a leather folder that undoubtedly contained the debt documentation, the payment demand, and whatever legal instruments he thought would be sufficient to close the trap. Josephine met him in the front parlor. Charles was not present. That had been her instruction. Mrs. Montgomery, Pratt said with that same oily courtesy he had always used with her. I'm afraid this is not a social call. I know what it is, Josephine said. She did not sit. Neither did he. You're here to collect a debt you helped create. His expression flickered. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. You altered my father's loan documents. You waited 7 years. You engineered this marriage specifically to maximize the damage when you called it in. And you did it because someone is paying you. Pratt's face went carefully blank. Those are serious accusations. They are, and I can prove all of them. She walked to the desk, opened the top drawer. My father kept copies, real copies, dated, notarized. He didn't trust you even then. She was lying. Her father had kept no such copies, but Pratt did not know that. I want to see them, he said. I'm sure you do. Unfortunately, they're not here. They're with a federal magistrate in Boston, along with a full accounting of your financial movements for the past 7 years, and a signed statement from Mr. Montgomery detailing every conversation you've had about this arrangement. Pratt's jaw tightened. You're bluffing, am I? She smiled. It was not a kind smile. Let me offer you a different arrangement. You walk out of this house. You destroy whatever fraudulent documents you're carrying. You leave Westcliff Harbor, and you never contact this family again. In exchange, we don't file criminal charges. You have no grounds. We have enough grounds to ensure you never work as a solicitor again. And that's if you're lucky. If you're unlucky, you'll spend the next 10 years in a federal prison explaining to a judge how you forged loan documents and attempted to defraud a federally chartered bank. The room was very quiet. Pratt looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw the moment he understood that he had miscalculated. that the 19-year-old girl he had manipulated 3 years ago was not the same woman standing in front of him now. "Who's paying you?" she asked. He said nothing. "It doesn't matter," she said. "They've already lost, because even if you had succeeded, even if you had taken everything, you would never have gotten what you actually wanted. Control. You would have gotten money, but control stays here, with us." Pratt turned and left without another word. Josephine stood in the parlor and listened to the sound of his carriage retreating down the drive. Then Charles came in from the study, where he had been waiting. "Did he believe you?" he asked. "He believed enough. And if he calls your bluff? Then we'll deal with it, but he won't. Men like Pratt only fight battles they're certain they can win. We just made him uncertain." Charles looked at her. "We make a good team." "Yes," she said. "We do." Spring came to Westcliff Harbor the way it always did. Slowly, reluctantly, with cold mornings and uncertain light. But the Montgomery house felt different now. Warmer, maybe. Or just less empty. They still took breakfast in relative silence, but sometimes Charles would look up from his papers and ask her opinion on a contract clause. Sometimes she would tell him about a letter from Eli, or a problem with the cannery accounts, and he would listen without offering solutions unless she asked for them. The federal charter was approved in June. The Caldwell assets were formally restored to the family in July. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Josephine realized that the careful distance they had maintained at the beginning had shifted into something else. Not passion, not romance in the conventional sense, but partnership, trust. The particular intimacy of two people who had faced something difficult together and had chosen not to run. One night in August, sitting in the library where she had first found his broken copy of Middlemarch, he asked her, "Do you regret it?" "Regret what?" "The arrangement. The marriage." She thought about it, about the girl who had walked into his house with a secret and a plan, about everything that had happened since. "No," she said. "I don't." He nodded, set down his book. "Neither do I." It was the closest either of them had come to saying what they both knew, that somewhere between the contract and the crisis, between the silence and the confession, they had built something real, and neither of them needed to say it out loud to make it true.